Thank you for coming out on this rather nice early summer's evening. Our speaker tonight is Professor Colin Holmes, who was a Professor of History at the University of Sheffield. May I call you Colin? Yes. Colin is a social historian. He has written and researched many aspects of social history, the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and many Jewish subjects. He's at the moment editing a series of essays on the East End historian William Fishman. He has written on anti-Semitism in the British Isles, and his book, John Bull's Ireland, is a standard work on immigration. Tonight he's talking about William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw. I know many of you and myself heard him during the war. He really was a nasty piece of work. He was fascist, Nazi, anti-Semitic, and a liar. But his end is controversial, and I'm certain that Colin will explain it this evening.
I'd like, first of all, to thank Malcolm for the very generous and warm correspondence he's had with me. Someone that he didn't even know when he started that correspondence, and he's got very good customer care skills. He should, in fact, be working for Marks and Spencer, I think. So I come this evening not to praise Malcolm, but to talk about someone else. And my talk is on William Joyce, otherwise known as Lord Haw Haw. My first real contact with Joyce came in the late 1970s, when I was working on my book on anti-Semitism in Britain. I came across quite a number of references to Joyce, and I began to slot them into a file. But my serious engagement with him didn't really begin until about the year 2000. Now, if you'd looked at my Wikipedia entry a few years ago, you would have found the following, and I quote here: "His long-awaited biography of William Joyce is now long overdue." So I say thank you to that anonymous scribe. I thought it was actually a disgruntled postgraduate who wrote that, but I gather from a third party it was somebody who likes my work and who lives in New York City. But I'm pleased to say that entry has now been amended. But he had a point, though, because even some friends began to think that my talking about a book on Joyce amounted to no more than a personal fantasy. Others who knew me better nevertheless thought I'd caught Gustave Flaubert's disease, that I'd become drenched in ink, and then, dissatisfied with what appeared on the page, I'd consign sheet after sheet to the waste paper basket. But, steadily, inexorably, the book was in fact taking shape. Two factors in particular amounted for the delay. First of all, I encountered some problems relating to the official records. At the start of my research, a number of documents I desperately wanted to read had not yet entered the public domain. They'd been retained by government departments. Now, that situation began to change in the 1990s. But this material came out in a trickle. It didn't come out in a gushing flow at all. And so I was left constantly wondering, is there something else lurking in the archives of the Home Office, the Metropolitan Police, the Foreign Office, or MI5, which might in fact shed light on Joyce? For that reason alone, I was very hesitant about handing the publication over to a publisher. In some cases, I had to submit freedom of information requests to government departments, and this process proved very time-consuming. Now, according to freedom of information legislation, one has to receive a reply within 21 working days. But government departments, being government departments, don't break a leg over this. And they constantly ask for extensions, which can go on for some time. And I remained acutely aware for some time that documents that I wanted, say on Joyce's Nazi contacts in the 1930s, had not yet been released, and some of them still haven't. He was very close to a German man called Kruger, who wrote under the name Peter Aldag. Peter Aldag wrote the book Das Judentum in England, which is a standard anti-Semitic history of Britain. He was denied entry to Britain in 1966. But there's no file on him in the National Archives. That file's been retained, and there's no explanation given, because MI5 and MI6 are exempt from freedom of information legislation. They don't have to explain anything to us. But eventually, in spite of these problems, I felt reasonably confident that I could in fact account for and explain the main contours of Joyce's political career. So that's one problem overcome. But then there's a second factor which held me up. There are collectors out there who are obsessed by anything relating to fascism. You think a few years ago about Hitler's diaries. These were genuine, who Trevor Roper said. Of course they weren't. They were fakes. They were forgeries. But Murdoch was prepared to pay big money to get them into the Sunday Times. Think of the market for Hitler's art. It's all fake. It's all forgery. But people buy this stuff. And anything relating to Joyce, even a signature, is a collector's item. For example, a few years ago, the Wiener Library, the Institute of Contemporary History in London, was given a collection of material on the Right Club, a neo-Nazi fellow travelling group in the late 1930s. And one letter in there was from Joyce. Now, I was the third person to read that file, and by the time I read it, Joyce's signature disappeared from the letter. Page 2 of the letter had simply disappeared. A collector had obviously taken it. Now, my problem with the Joyce book began when I asked a collector about Margaret Joyce's letters. That was Joyce's second wife. And he wrote back to me and said, "I've got a shock for you." He says, "I got copyright over everything that Joyce wrote. His letters, his newspaper articles, everything. And you can't publish anything without my permission." So at that point I thought, well, that's it. The book might have to be thrown on the back of the fire. This was too complicated for me to handle. And so my publisher got their lawyers onto this. The person who claimed copyright got his lawyers onto it. And to cut a very long and complicated and stressful story short, this went on for over 9 months. That episode, as you can imagine, proved extremely stressful. But fortunately, as I say, the book did eventually appear in 2016, Searching for Lord Haw-Haw. Whoever said that writing history, writing biography is easy, anybody can do it? No, they can't. There are all kinds of problems. Completely different episode, though, came one afternoon when I was sitting in my room at the university, doing no harm to anybody, dreaming away. There was a knock on the door. A student came in. Who is she? I don't know who she is. And she introduced herself. And she said, "I'm William Joyce's granddaughter. I think you're writing a book on him." "Sit down," I said. And that gave me entree into the family. And some of this material, which I obtained through that source, was the main source of contention with that collector who claimed to have copyright. So much for background. Let's turn to Joyce. And I want you, first of all, to use your historical imagination. It's early January 1946. It's a bitterly cold morning, and you're standing outside Wandsworth Prison in London. Inside, an execution is about to take place. Albert Pierpoint, the state executioner since 1932, is about to top another prisoner. Pierpoint had a very busy schedule in 1945-46. He was hanging Nazi war criminals. It didn't take long, it wouldn't take long, because Pierpoint prided himself, in his own words, as being as fast as a whippet, which he was in this case. Now I need you then to cast your minds back 6 years earlier, Sarah Bellamy, aged 53, lived in Pittsmore, a working-class area of Sheffield. One cold evening in January 1940, she and her husband listened to a broadcast transmitted from Berlin. Listening to Nazi radio was never illegal in wartime Britain. If German subjects listened to British broadcasts, they could be executed. So they listened to the broadcast. They then had their supper. Mr. Bellamy went to bed and left his wife downstairs. She washed up the supper pots. She dried them. She put them away. And then she put her head in the gas oven. And he found her the following morning. He said that, in fact, she'd been very depressed by that broadcast from Berlin. Now, the person that Pierpoint hanged in 1946, the broadcaster who depressed Mrs. Bellamy in January 1940, was William Joyce, better known throughout the war as Lord Haw-Haw. But who was he? What is the person that I'm talking about? I ask if only because when interviewed recently by the media editor of the Sheffield Telegraph, he told me that he was on the Sheffield tram reading my book, and when the woman opposite said to him, "Is that yet another book on Hitler?" And he said, No, it's a book on William Joyce. And he said at that point her eyes glazed over. She'd never heard of him. She didn't know who he was. So broadly, who was he? And how did his life unfold? How did it unfold up to the point when Pierpoint hanged him in January 1946? Let's go back to the beginning and trace it through. And I have to say to you that most biographers can tell you when their subject was born. But Joyce's birth is actually uncertain. The conventional date is that he was born in April 1906 in Brooklyn, New York City. But if you look at evidence that's left by Joyce and by his family, when there's no threat to giving this information, he's born anywhere between 1903 and 1906. And there's one very curious incident in 1939. In 1939, Joyce makes his last job application in this country to Gabbitas Thring, the education agency. And at that interview, he claimed to be 33. Well, the person who interviewed him and who filled in the record card described him as, and I quote, an Irish gent claiming to be 36. Claiming to be 33, but in fact 36. In other words, that person who interviewed him at Gabbitas Thring thought he was born in 1903. Now, what did that person know that we don't know? But he said it quite confidently. He writes it out quite confidently on the record card. This man is lying to me when he said that he was born in 1906. He was actually born in 1903. Now, you might say, well, there must be a birth certificate, and there is a birth certificate, and I have a copy, American birth certificate. But you see, there are problems with that as well. It's signed by a man called Charles Yerden. Now, Yerden was a physician. He died in 1937. He's in the list of the medical practitioners in America. But Yerden is missing from all the first three census returns in America in the 20th century. So what's going on here? Who was Yerden? Where was he? What was he up to? It's all very strange. So you're left with some doubt about exactly when and where Joyce was born. Now, if you want me to speculate, I'll do that in questions. But what I'm flagging up initially is that the thing is not quite straightforward. What is more straightforward is that Joyce's father was Irish, and that like many of the countrymen in the west of Ireland, he'd emigrated to America in the late 19th century. Joyce's mother was English, very middle class. Her father was medical officer of health for the Oldham district in Manchester. And the couple met when they were on holiday, when she was on holiday with her father in Galway. There she met Michael Joyce. And the couple married in New York in 1905. There's something very strange about that as well, because your daughter, your only daughter, is getting married in New York. You go with her, don't you? No, the parents don't go to the wedding. They don't go. They send her brother, Edgar. And they send Edgar Brooke, a solicitor, quote, to see that things are done properly. What on earth does that mean? I'm posing, you see, a number of questions here. You've got to be thinking fast on your feet. It's not simple, this. It's complicated. Even though it's 8 o'clock in the evening, and you should be clicking over. The family left New York. Joyce, his mother, and he left New York in 1909. His mother couldn't stand New York. She didn't like the teeming mass of ethnic arrangement that you got in New York. She wanted a much simpler arrangement. And they went and they lived in Galway, mainly. And they left Galway in 1921. Joyce left Galway in 1921, courtesy of a rat line arranged for him by the British Army. Now, you might say, well, why does the British Army get a young lad out of Ireland? And the reason for that was that the Joyce family were very pro-British. They were not Irish nationalists. They hated Irish nationalists. Joyce hated them to the end of his life. And they helped the British forces against the Irish nationalists. And there was, in fact, an attempt in 1921 by the IRA to execute Joyce. Now, through a school friend, he had a contacts with the army, and the army got him out of Ireland in 1921 on his own. His family don't come out until 1923, so here's this young lad, whatever age he is, living in London by himself. Between 1921 and 1939, Joyce lived in London. He graduated with a first-class honours degree in English from the University of London in 1927. He wrote a classic article, which in a very prestigious journal, on vowel sounds in the English language. He was nobody's fool. He married for the first time in that same year, 1927. And during these years, 21 to 39, he mixed increasingly in Tory and increasingly then in fascist circles. But in late August 1939, with Margaret, his second wife, he left for Berlin to work for the Nazis. And he broadcast on German radio between 1939 and 1945. And he was an important figure there. Goebbels, in his diary, if you read Goebbels' diary, he said, he's the best horse in my stable. With the collapse of the Nazi state, 1945, Joyce and Margaret were on the run. And we find them next in Flensburg, which is in Schleswig-Holstein. And they had an argument. They were always arguing. They lived quarrelsomely, as they say. They were both having affairs all the time. They divorced in Berlin. They remarried, but that didn't stop them both having affairs. And he'd had an argument with Margaret, and he takes hold of his treasured Norwegian walking stick, and he goes out for a walk. And he sees some British soldiers gathering firewood. Now, the soldiers had an inkling that Joyce might be in the area, but they hadn't seen him. But Joyce sees them, and they're gathering the firewood, and he says, "Il y a des morceaux ici." There's some more here, in French. And then he speaks to them in English. One of them says, "Hang on, I think I recognise that voice. I think that's William Joyce." And so they confront him. "You are William Joyce, aren't you? Or are you William Joyce?" And Joyce reaches for his pocket, because in his pocket he's been given a false German passport. He's now Wilhelm Hansen, a language teacher. But of course the soldiers think he's going for a gun, and so they shoot him and disable him and capture him. There's a very interesting Sheffield connection there, because the senior officer in charge of that party, Captain Licorice, after the war managed the George Hotel at Hatherseat, which is just outside Sheffield. Sadly, Licorice died himself about 1949. And after being wounded at Flensburg, Joyce was hospitalised and then flown to Britain. He was tried at the Old Bailey in September 1945. He was found guilty of treason. He was sentenced to death. All his appeals failed. He went right through to the Lords. And Edie Rutherford, a mass observer from Sheffield, was very pleased by this outcome. That bastard's got his just deserts. And I think that sentiment was mirrored by most of the British public. Now, Joyce has not been easy to write about, and it was a short and tragic life, though he wouldn't have seen it as a tragedy. But is it significant? MI5 described Joyce as, above all, a politico, and his career touches three major themes: fascism, anti-Semitism, and treachery. Let's take fascism first. Recent present-day fascism isn't a new phenomenon in British life. Groups such as the White Defence League, the National Socialist movement of the 1960s, and later organisations such as the National Front and the British National Party, and more recently Britain First, National Action, and the North West Wolves, are merely the latest manifestations of a fascist tradition in Britain. Joyce's fascism can be traced back to the 1920s, and it occupied him, possessed him for the rest of his life. Now, why did he engage in that commitment? Why did he become a fascist? First of all, I think there are four social political reasons that drove him in that direction. First of all, he regretted the partition of Ireland. He would never have allowed that if he'd had his way. Ireland should be a united country under British control. Secondly, he was worried about the threat of Bolshevism after 1917. And in Joyce's eyes, Bolshevism was associated with Jews and materialism. Thirdly, the economic problems of the war, of the interwar years, also played on his thinking. And finally, Joyce and his fascist comrades drew strength from what was happening in Germany, Portugal and Spain. Areas of Western and Central Europe were going fascist. This was the way to the future. The old system had it. It couldn't deliver. The background here is the Great Depression of the interwar years. And within this situation, Joyce's career as a fascist is, I think, significant in three ways. First of all, he was a very important propagandist for the British Union of Fascists when he was in this country. He was the director of propaganda. And he continued in similar vein when he worked in Nazi Germany. Remember that remark by Goebbels? He's the best horse in my stable. Second reason, it's been suggested recently that fascism in the 1930s was merely a form of contemporary chic. Mary Kenny says that fascism in the 30s was a form of contemporary chic. In its early days, it was harmless. It was even praiseworthy, she says. Yes, really, she wrote that. But then as now, fascism could not be separated from violence. And Joyce's career underlines as much. His career underlines that there is within fascism, there is a violent tradition. Joyce was always ready for a scrap. And this propensity also spilled over into his private life. Margaret was always up for a good beating, which he often gave her. He's a propagandist. He's a violent fascist. He's also in the Nazi mould. Some fascists in Britain turned to Italy and to Mussolini as their model. But to Joyce, Hitler and Nazi Germany was the key to the future. It's an important career then as a fascist. But what about his anti-Semitism? Joyce's anti-Semitism, I would argue, is the central feature of his political life. Now, anti-Semitism in Britain in the 1930s wasn't new. It wasn't uncommon in the pre-Holocaust years. Malcolm Muggeridge wrote, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism was in the air. There was an unmistakable tang." And Joyce's anti-Semitism at this time is remarkable in 5 ways. First of all, he was a racist anti-Semite. He believed that Jews were programmed to behave as they did. They couldn't operate in any other way. They're different. Secondly, his hatred was overt. Whereas Oswald Mosley and the Daily Mail were very careful in their choice of words when attacking Jews, Joyce showed no such restraint. To him, Marxism was, and I quote, Marx was, I quote, a verminous old Jew, unquote. And Jews were Orientals, he said. They're oleaginous parasites who had no place in Western society. The third point, his extreme anti-Semitism, rested on his total belief also in an international Jewish conspiracy. He absorbed that notion of the protocols, which had surfaced first of all in the early 20th century. He believed that Jews everywhere were engaged in a conspiracy for ultimate Jewish control. Fourth reason why his anti-Semitism is interesting is that his hatred was total. Not only did he attack his political opponents when they were Jewish, he also used it to explain incidents in his own personal life. If you look at portraits of Joyce, you'll see a large scar on his face. He was slashed at a political meeting in 1924, and he always told the story that he was slashed by a Jewish communist. But when I interviewed Joyce's first wife, she said he was a liar. He was actually slashed by a woman who came from Ireland looking for him for what he had done in Ireland. Joyce, I say, was very bright. Got her first at London, started a research career. Never finished it. Why? Because he said a Jewish woman tutor stole my research notes. It's a fantasy. But Jews are responsible for the small things in his life, the personal things in his life, as well as for political problems. My final point about Joyce's anti-Semitism is this. Since he believed that Jews were different, racially different, since he believed in a conspiratorial view of the world, Joyce was, I argue, an exterminatory anti-Semite. He thought that Jewish communists in the 1930s should have been shot in the streets of London. He was quite happy to do that. He said that rich Jews should have been hanged from the lampposts in Westminster before the Second World War. If they had, there'd have been no war at all. This war was got up by Jews for their own benefit. They should have been executed. Later on, when he knows about the Holocaust, when he's been captured and he's in prison, writing to Margaret, he shows no concern at all for the fate of Jews in Europe. His major concern was for the fate of the German people, who he said had been burdened with an enormous legacy. There's nothing at all there about the Jews that makes him feel ill at ease with himself. He's a fascist then, a violent Nazi fascist. He's an anti-Semite, a racist, conspiratorial, exterminatory anti-Semite. But what about Joyce's treason? Because that's the third strand of the argument in the discussion this evening. 3 points, if I may. First of all, Joyce wasn't the only person who worked for the Nazis during the war. And his career underlines that there is a tradition of treachery on the political right. Too much emphasis has been placed in the literature on Stalin's Englishmen, Blunt, Philby, Maclean and Burgess. There are people on the right who give their allegiance to a foreign power as well. I think it's important to make that point. Although he wasn't the only person who worked for the Nazis, there are 75 files in the National Archives on British nationals who worked in one way or other for the Nazis. 3 were executed after the war. 2 were sentenced to death and then reprieved. The others received jail sentences. But he was certainly the most significant radio traitor to affect the British public in the 20th century. Now, there is a view that Joyce was something of a joke. Absolutely untrue. Don't buy into that argument. Joyce only becomes a joke after 1943. And you can see why 1943 is important, because by then, you had Stalingrad. You've had the defeat in the desert. The war is going against Germany. So people can afford to be more relaxed about him. But if you listen to those early broadcasts, those broadcasts that depressed Mrs. Bellamy, they're very powerful even now. If you listen, for example, to his broadcast after the fall of France in July 1940, he claims to be travelling with the Wehrmacht. Of course, he's never left Berlin. But he said, just think, 37 days, That's all it's taken us. We smashed through Holland, smashed through Luxembourg, smashed through Belgium, and now we've got the great prize of France. We've got Paris. And then he says, and make no mistake, to his British listeners, your turn's coming. Now the day and the hour, the minute, the second, these are Hitler's secrets. But you're in for it. And when the invasion is launched, your papier-mâché defences will stand no chance against the Wehrmacht. You've had it. You're finished. Done. Kaput. Very powerful stuff. Joyce's treason also created a tremendous problem for the authorities. Not only was he significant as a radio traitor, but he also was, as I say, if you believe the story, he was born in New York City in 1906. Now, if you're thinking fast on your feet, you will say, wait a minute, how can the British hang an American for treason? Joyce had applied for a British passport, claiming to be British. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. In 1933, 1938, and 1939. And that 1939 passport went on until July 1940. And Shawcross argued with the Attorney General that if an alien clothes himself in the Union Jack, he owes an allegiance to the Crown, wherever he may be. So until July 1940, Joyce was technically a British subject, was broadcasting for the Nazis. And it's a controversial point of law. And it's even more controversial by the fact that the decision on whether that argument of the Attorney General stood up in court had to be made by the judge, Mr. Justice Tucker. You say, well, what's the problem? Well, in 1940, Tucker had tried a case when somebody tries to reach Joyce in Berlin. And in his summing up, Tucker describes Joyce as a traitor. Can you imagine now a judge who would describe somebody in that way being put on a major trial later on? Would never have happened. But this is 1945, 1946. People in Sheffield are lying dead under the rubble on the moor. People were mourning loved ones who had been killed in the war. People have been lost in the bombing. People have been lost at the front. That's the atmosphere in which the whole thing has to be set. Joyce was then significant as a fascist, an anti-Semite, and a traitor. And at no point, did he apologise for any of this. On fascism, he continued to believe it was the greatest doctrine since the Renaissance, and those who start against it would lose the battle. On anti-Semitism, he retained his belief right to the very end. Indeed, he believed that Jews had organised his trial and his execution from the Old Bailey. He even believed that Shawcross, the Attorney General, was a Jew. He called him one of the Cheetham fraternity. Now, Shawcross wasn't Jewish, but Joyce in his mind thought, yes, I'm being persecuted, therefore there must be a Jewish link here. And he said to be put to death by Jews, as he was going to be, was a death with honour. He said it is like a soldier's end at Stalingrad. On treason, why should he apologise? He never regarded himself as a traitor. On the contrary, he viewed his activities as totally patriotic. Britain, he said, was being destroyed in the late 30s by a corrupt old gang of politicians aided by the Jews. And this entire edifice had to be swept away. The whole country had got to be put under Nazi rule so that in fact it could be cleansed and then become Great Britain once again. So when Jim Scarden goes to Lüneburg, where Joyce is in his hospital bed, to interrogate him, Scarden became one of MI5's super sleuth interrogators. He has no problem with Joyce. None at all. Because Joyce treats him almost like a priest in a confessional. And he tells him everything. He tells him all this, putting the rope round his neck in effect. But to Joyce, you see, it was all straightforward. I've not betrayed anybody. I'm really looking after British interests, primarily. So why should I apologise? It's important then, as a fascist, an anti-Semite and a traitor, and someone who's totally unrepentant about any of this. Now, standing back from all this, he was, obviously, as Malcolm indicated earlier on, a nasty, vicious politico. In his politics, he divided the world between those who were intelligent enough to agree with him and those obviously deluded souls who didn't. He tolerated the former, not as equals, but as acolytes who were there to serve him. And he despised those who opposed him. He would lash them with his tongue. He'd thump them with his fists. And in some cases, he argued they should be killed. As a politico, he was then insufferably self-obsessed, someone convinced from childhood, in fact, of his own special qualities. My childhood hero was Rupert Bear, with the red jumper and the yellow trousers, but not to Joyce. Joyce's childhood hero was Napoleon. Now that says something about the child becoming the man. Now in private, he could be very good company. He was extremely intelligent. He was very widely read. And if a drink were on offer, the conversation would flow. The crack would be good. But even in private, he could soon become too much for most people, with his unyielding opinions, his scathing assessments, and his impressions. Margaret, his second wife, bore the brunt of a great deal of this. In one of his prison letters, he writes to Margaret, he says, "Do not think, my darling sweetheart, that I am addressing you as if you were a public meeting." But he was, and always did, and he did to other people as well. It's also quite cruel about Margaret in those letters as well. He said, "Now that she's sexually useless to me, I don't want anything to do with her. And I've told her it's too late for her to become a whore." The only person who stayed the course with him was a man called John McNabb, surgeon's son. McNabb stayed with Joyce right to the very end. He worshipped Joyce as a god, and Joyce kept on the right side of McNabb because McNabb provided the money for Joyce's political activities. When Joyce was executed in 1946, McNabb took himself off to Spain, worked for Franco's radio, wrote a classic book on bullfighting, which was published in London in 1966, and died in Spain in 1977. McNabb's son is a leading Green politician in Spain. Now, on hearing these remarks about Joyce, you might conclude that he was mad. But be extremely careful. You need a sharper categorization on this. And for some time, I found it very difficult to understand Joyce's psyche. But I do have a friend, a psychiatrist, and we meet from time to time to have dinner. And I said to him once, I really can't understand this guy that I'm writing about. He says, "Tell me about him." So I told him the major characteristics. He says, "The guy's a narcissist." He says, "I'll give you the clinical case book. He ticks all the boxes." And that gave me an insight into Joyce's personality. And if you need any firm evidence as to whether Joyce was a narcissist, turn to his wartime diary. And in there, he says at one point, "If I had been at the right hand of the old man is Hitler, the war would have been over 4.5 years ago, and Germany would have been victorious." Now, staggering claim to make by anybody. What did Jodl, what did Keitel know about military tactics? If he'd been in the wolf's lair at Hitler's side, everything would have been all right. Germany would have been victorious. Everything would have come out all right. I would argue then that Joyce is not only influenced in his politics by those social, political circumstances that I mentioned earlier on, but also by his authoritarian, rigid, uncompromising nationalism. It drove him towards his fascism, cemented his anti-Semitism, and goes some way towards explaining why he left Britain in 1939. When he sails away from Dover, you watch the white cliffs receding in the distance. He's convinced he's sailing into a bright and golden future, into a new world, leaving the old, parasitic, decaying world behind. He's on a messianic task. Now, to offer you a wider picture, I would argue he's not the only narcissist one can identify in recent politics. Oswald Mosley was a narcissist. Biographers refer to Mosley's overbearing sense of self-worth. That's what it is, really. And let me quote from someone closer to you in time, and I'd set you a task. Do you recognize the following voice? "I am the catalyst for the downfall of the Blairites, the Clintonites, the Bushites, and all those dreadful people working hand in glove with Goldman Sachs and everybody else, who have made themselves rich and ruined our countries. Who's that? No. Nigel Farage. That's BBC News, 10th of November 2016. You want me to quote it again? I, underlined, I am the catalyst for the downfall of the Blairites, the Clintonites, the Bushites, and all those dreadful people who, working hand in glove with Goldman Sachs and everybody else, have made themselves rich and ruined our countries. And there are others who are narcissists as well. I would argue that Blair is a narcissist. You share the lead with George Bush in invading Iraq, and then you think you're well equipped to head the Middle East peace process. Translated, it means I'm right all along. I know what should happen now. Now, there's a narcissist for you. There's a very interesting cartoon by Peter Brooks in the Times on the 26th of November 2016, and Blair is portrayed as a peacock. And then there's Trump. Trump says on record, I don't want to delve too much into my own mind. I might not like what I find there. Now, in his case, the Association of American Psychiatrists have issued a recent report describing him without qualification as having the signs of a clinical narcissistic disorder. Narcissism, I think, is very important in politics. I don't know whether you read the Times. Malcolm reads it. I don't know whether you noticed the obituary of Brian Weldon in the Times on the 13th of May 2019, former Labour MP, then radio presenter. The last sentence is from Weldon himself. It says, what a romance my life has been. Mainly, of course, with myself. Narcissism is a very important feature of Joyce's personality and the personality of other politicians. It explains a good deal about him. I'm coming towards the end now, but over the years, my work has focused on that world which Norman Cohen, in Warrant for Genocide, once described as consisting of psychopaths, crooks and fanatics. I've lived my life with these people. These people at times have severely impacted on the societies where they lived. Now, Joyce lived and agitated constantly, tirelessly, as an inhabitant of this world, and he died in it, regretting absolutely nothing. And if we'd had better technical support this evening, I'm going to play you the final recording from Hamburg. Joyce's broadcast when he's clearly madly drunk, thumping the table for emphasis. But the key phrase in that is, Es liebe Deutschland, Heil Hitler and farewell. Germany will live. Heil Hitler and farewell. That world still has its inhabitants, and some of them have gained political power. Political power which Joyce always craved but never attained. And now, as in the past, they have the power to be dangerous. In Joyce's case, power ultimately eluded him. But he was constantly scheming. He was unashamedly exploitative. He was always ruthless. He was frequently vicious. He was often violent. He believed in killing. He, too, was certainly very dangerous indeed.
Okay, the irony is that Lord Haw was shot and captured by a German Jew who was fighting with the British forces, Horst Peschover. I know this because a few years ago I was researching British war heroes who were Jewish who shouldn't have been fighting in the war. And I interviewed a guy called Geoffrey Perry in London before he died. He was a millionaire publisher, but his original name was Horst Peschover. And he was the one who was number 2 to Captain Licorice in the border between Germany and Denmark when they came across Lord Haw, and I'll call him Geoffrey Perry Horst, took out his gun and shot Lord Haw in the leg and buttock, thinking that Lord Haw, as you say, was about to shoot his way out of the capture. The the story of Geoffrey Perry, it was quite interesting. He shouldn't have been in the British Army because he came over as a refugee to England, went to Buxton High School in Derbyshire, was interned into the Isle of Man as an enemy alien, but he'd previously worked for the Daily Mirror as a photographer. He was a very good photographer. And then he was rescued from the Isle of Man to join the British Forces Special Operations to go over to Germany to interview Nazis because he spoke perfect German. Now, he was underage. He shouldn't have been taken into the British Army, but everybody lied about his age because he was much younger than the age to go into the forces. He went over to Germany under special operations. He manned the radio station in Hanover that Lord Haw had broadcast from, and then was going to denazify one of the German newspapers near the border when, as you say, he came across Lord Haw. He recognised Lord Haw's accent as British and who he was. And as Lord Haw put his hand into the pocket to produce a fake passport to show that he was a German citizen, Geoffrey shot him in the buttock and leg and captured him. And the irony also of all this is that, he was Jewish. Secondly, he sent a letter to his family in England, because his mother had escaped as a refugee before the war, to explain what he'd done, and that went into the Daily Mirror, the newspaper where he was the photographer and the journalist for. Montgomery, the commander, recommended him for a medal, but Montgomery refused to give him a medal because, A, he was Jewish, and secondly, because a serving soldier should not have an article about his exploits in the newspaper. So it was ironical that Lord Haw was shot by a Jew.
Radio Jacob.
Our next speaker will be Jennifer Craig Norton, who you'll remember, an American lady based at the University of Southampton. You'll remember last time she gave a wonderful talk on Jewish refugee domestics in England. This time it is her original research into the Polish Warsaw Kindertransport. Not many people have heard of this, but she has done original research and it's going to be very interesting.